Pull that chair closer. No, closer than that. Right here by the hearth, where the heat's proper. The stones have been warming since this afternoon, and they'll hold it through till dawn, if we feed them right. Here, let me fill your glass. This porter's dark as the water between here and the Hebrides, and it goes down easier. You've come in from the cold, haven't you? I can always tell. There's a particular look folk get when they've been walking after dark with nothing but the wind for company. That tension in the shoulders. The way the eyes take a moment to settle once they've found the firelight. Listen to that gale. Straight off the Atlantic, that is. The sort that doesn't just blow, it hunts. Finds every gap in the mortar, every loose slate, every place where the old timber's gone soft. On a night like this, you're grateful for thick walls and a door that knows its business. The outer Hebrides get weather like this all winter. Worse sometimes. The islands out there, Lewis, Harris, the smaller rocks beyond, they take the full weight of what the ocean sends. No shelter, no mercy, just stone and sea and the space between. 20 miles west of Lewis, there's a cluster of rocks they call the Seven Hunters. 7 barren lumps of gneiss rising out of the Atlantic swell. Black as old iron, steep as Kirk walls. The Flannan Isles, if you want the Christian name. But the folk who knew them best, the men from Lewis, who'd go out there once a year to take birds and eggs, they called them the Hunters, and they treated them with the sort of respect you save for things that might bite. The fowlers had rules for those rocks, strict ones, not the sort you bend because it's inconvenient. You landed, you uncovered your head, you turned sunwise, clockwork, always clockwise, and you thanked God you'd made it. Then you minded your tongue. Certain words couldn't be spoken out there. You didn't say rock, you said crewy, meaning hard. You didn't say water, you said burn. And you absolutely did not say kirk or minister, not if you valued your skin. The place belonged to older things than the church, and those things had long memories. The islands weren't meant for habitation. Everyone knew that. They were a threshold, a margin, the sort of place where the rules of the mainland didn't quite hold, and where permanence was asking for trouble. But by the end of the last century, maritime commerce didn't care much for local superstition. Ships crossing the North Atlantic needed a light to guide them past the western outliers, and the Northern Lighthouse Board decided the biggest of the 7 hunters, Eilean Mòr they called it, the Big Isle, would bear that light. They built a tower there, 75 feet of white-painted masonry rising from the black rock, crowned with a lens that could throw its beam 20 miles into the darkness. It cost a fortune, took years. Every stone, every timber, every drop of lamp oil had to be hauled up sheer cliffs from boats tossing in the swell. But when it was finished in 1899, it stood like a declaration. Civilization had planted its flag on the edge of the world. 3 men at a time kept that light burning. 6 weeks on the rock, 2 weeks on shore. The station was provisioned every fortnight by the lighthouse tender, weather permitting. The keepers lived by a rigid routine. Trim the wicks, polish the lens, record the weather, keep the compound spotless. Discipline against the chaos of the sea. For a year, it worked. Then, in December of 1900, the light went out, and when the relief ship finally made it through the gales to investigate, what they found on Eilean Mòr wasn't bodies or wreckage or any kind of comprehensible disaster. They found silence. 3 men, experienced, capable, not given to fancies, had vanished without a word. The lighthouse was in order. The work was done. The kitchen was clean. But the men were gone. And the only clue to what had called them out into the Atlantic winter was a coat still hanging on its peg. The relief ship was called the Hesperus. She'd been meant to reach the Flannans on the 20th of December, the regular rotation, but the weather had other ideas. A gale blew in from the west and held the ship trapped at Breescleet on Lewis for 6 days. The sort of storm that turns the sea white and makes even harbour walls seem inadequate. Captain Harvey finally got her out on Boxing Day. 26 miles across open water, the Hesperus rolling in the swell, her steam whistle blowing as she approached the east landing. Protocol demanded it. The keepers would hear the whistle, raise the flag, fire a rocket in acknowledgement, have the landing ready. Nothing happened. The ship drifted closer. The whistle blew again, shrill and insistent in the grey morning. The cliffs of Eilean Mòr rose dark against the sky, and at the top of them the lighthouse stood white and still. But no flag moved on the staff. No rocket arced up from the compound. No figures appeared on the landing steps. Joseph Moore was the relief keeper. His job was to go ashore, hand over supplies, take the outgoing man back to Lewis. Routine. He'd done it a dozen times. But as the small boat pulled away from the Hesperus and began the approach to the landing, he felt something settle on him. A weight. A wrongness he couldn't name. The landing was empty. The provision boxes that should have been stacked and ready weren't there. The mooring ropes hung slack. Moore climbed out onto the stone platform and started up the steps. 160 of them, cut into the cliff, steep as a ladder. His breath came short, and not just from the climb. The entrance gate to the compound was closed. He pushed it open. The path to the lighthouse door was swept clean. Everything tidy, everything in its place. But the silence pressed on his ears like deep water. The door was shut, not locked. He went inside. The kitchen was the first room. The fire in the grate was dead, the ashes long cold. The clock on the wall had stopped. And here's where you need to pay attention, because this is where the story you've heard and the story that happened start to split apart. The poets will tell you there was a meal on the table. Dinner laid out, still steaming, abandoned mid-bite. That's a lie. A good lie, the sort that makes the skin prickle, but a lie all the same. Joseph Moore found the kitchen clean. The pots washed and put away, the table bare. The sort of order you'd expect from men who'd finished their work and cleaned up after. Except for one thing. A chair, overturned, lying on its side in the middle of that tidy room. Moore checked the rest of the station. The bedrooms were made up, the blankets folded. The lamps in the tower had been trimmed and filled, the lens polished to brilliance. The light was ready to be lit. All the tasks of the forenoon shift had been completed with the care of men who knew their business. The logbook on the desk showed entries up to the 13th of December, routine observations of wind and pressure, and a slate board used for temporary notes before transferring them to the official log had a final entry timed at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 15th. Wind direction, barometer reading. The work of men still alive, still rational, still performing their duties. Then Moore went to check the entrance hall, where the gear hung on its pegs. James Ducat's oilskins were gone. Thomas Marshall's oilskins were gone. Both men had gone outside prepared for weather, equipped as any prudent keeper would be. But Donald McArthur's oilskins were still there. hanging on the peg where he'd left them. Mòr stood in that hallway and felt the cold work its way into his chest. McArthur was the local man, the Louisian, the one who'd grown up with the sea. He knew what the Atlantic could do. He knew you didn't step outside in December without your coat. Yet something had pulled him out of that lighthouse in such haste, with such urgency, that he'd abandoned the most basic protection a keeper had. He'd run out into the winter in his shirt sleeves, and he'd never come back. The superintendent arrived 3 days later, Robert Muirhead, Northern Lighthouse Board, a practical man not given to speculation. He walked the station with Mòr, examined the logbook, checked the stores. Then he went down to the west landing. The east landing, where the Hesperus had moored, was intact, but the west landing, on the far side of the island, told a different story. There was a wooden box stored in a crevice there, 33 meters above the normal sea level. It held mooring ropes and tackle, essential gear. The box had been smashed to pieces. Its contents were scattered across the rocks. The iron railings along the footpath were bent, not rusted through, not weakened by age. Bent, twisted like wire. A section of the railway track, the iron rails bolted into concrete that ran from the landing up to the compound, had been torn out of its foundations, and a block of stone, a lump of gneiss weighing close to a ton, and had been moved from its resting place. The damage wasn't confined to the landing. Higher up, at the top of the cliff, 60 meters above the sea, 200 feet, the turf had been ripped away in strips, as if something had reached up and clawed at the island itself. Muirhead stood there in the wind and tried to imagine the force required. The mass of water, the velocity, the sheer violence needed to bend iron and move stone at that height. The sea could do it. He'd seen storm damage before, but this wasn't the patient erosion of centuries. This was a single event, a surge, a hand reaching up from the Atlantic and swatting the rock. He reconstructed it as best he could. On the morning of the 15th, the wind had likely dropped. The slate said as much. Ducat and Marshall, the senior men, had probably gone down to secure the tackle box, knowing another gale was coming and wanting the gear safe. McArthur stayed in the lighthouse, the occasional keeper, the relief man. His job was to mind the station while the others worked. Then he saw it, or heard it, the wave coming in. He ran, knocked the chair over in his haste, didn't stop for his coat, didn't stop for anything, just ran for the door, perhaps shouting, perhaps thinking he could warn them, perhaps simply acting on the instinct that says you don't let your mates die alone. The sea took all three. No bodies were ever found. The Atlantic doesn't give back what it claims. The current out there runs deep and cold, and the flesh of drowned men feeds things that live in the dark. The news reached the mainland slow, the way bad news always did when it had to travel by sea. The Hesperus returned to Briskleet with Joseph Mòr still shaking, his account already beginning to sound like something from a fever dream. 3 men vanished, no bodies, no struggle, just a stopped clock and an empty station. The newspapers got hold of it by New Year, and that's when the myth started to grow. The reporters wanted answers, the public wanted a story, and when the fact didn't satisfy, when the explanation was nothing more than a rogue wave and bad timing, the embellishments began. Someone, somewhere, invented the meal on the table. Perhaps they misunderstood Mòr's testimony. Perhaps they simply needed the image. The untouched dinner still warm, The chairs pushed back as if the men had stood up mid-bite and walked into oblivion. It's a powerful picture, isn't it? The interrupted communion. The sanctuary of the table violated. The poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson seized on it in 1912, wrote his ballad Flannan Isles, and gave the lie its wings. Yet, as we crowded through the door, we only saw a table spread for dinner, meat and cheese and bread, but all untouched and no one there. Never happened, but it's the version that stuck. Then came the logbook entries, the mad log, they call it now. Stories started circulating in the middle years of the last century, claiming the official record showed the keepers had been experiencing something before they vanished. Entries describing Ducat as very quiet, McArthur crying, the men on their knees praying, as a storm raged outside that wasn't there. Days of mounting terror culminating in a final entry. God is over all. Compelling that. The idea that the lighthouse keepers had been under siege by something they couldn't name, that they'd watched it coming and could only pray while it closed in, except none of it in the archives. The logbook was routine. The slate was routine. The weather observations matched what the mainland stations recorded. There was no phantom storm, no crying, no prayers scrawled in desperation. The mad log is pure invention, fake law, the sort of thing that gets added when the truth isn't dramatic enough. But here's what the archives do show, and it's colder than any invented horror. The final slate entry was made at 9 in the morning on Saturday the 15th of December. The men had completed their morning tasks. They'd trimmed the lamps, filled the oil reservoirs, polished the lens. The station was ready for the lighting that would happen at dusk. Everything was in order. They were waiting for the night, and sometime in the hours that followed, something called them out. The landing gear damaged at the west landing wasn't fresh. Muirhead's report noted that some of the destruction might have occurred during earlier storms in the days leading up to the 15th, but the final damage, the evidence that a massive sea had come ashore on that day specifically, was undeniable. The turf torn from the cliff top, the relocated stone, the twisted iron. The sea had announced itself, and the men, experienced men who knew the moods of the Atlantic, had gone down to meet it. Why McArthur left without his coat remains the question that won't settle. You can construct rational explanations. Perhaps he was already outside when the wave came, and the coat left on the peg belonged to a fourth man. A confusion in the inventory. Perhaps he'd been in the process of putting it on when he heard the shout and dropped it to run. Perhaps he'd made a calculation. Seconds matter, the code doesn't, and gambled wrong. Or perhaps what he saw from the lighthouse window was so immediate, so terrible, that the old rules of caution simply ceased to apply. The Flannan Isles light was automated in 1971. No keepers now, just machinery and solar panels and a radio beacon. The compound is still there, weathering slowly into the rock. The railway track has rusted. The tower stands white against the black stone, blinking its warning to ships that no longer need it. Navigation being what it is these days. But the silence that Joseph Moore walked into on Boxing Day 1900, that hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, thick as the heart, settling over the seven hunters every time the wind drops and the sea goes quiet. The locals on Lewis will tell you the islands were never meant to be tamed. The old taboos weren't superstition, they were accommodation. You didn't name the rock because the rock didn't want to be named. You didn't build on the hunters because the hunters didn't permit building. And when the lighthouse went up anyway, when the electric light began to burn in that place of old darkness, something took notice. The phantom of the 7 hunters, they called it, in the old stories. The spirit that resented habitation. Whether you credit that or not doesn't much matter. The sea did the work either way, and the sea doesn't care what you call it. Superintendent Muirhead's report concluded with a single dry sentence. I am of the opinion that the men were swept away by a very heavy sea while attending to the mooring ropes at the West Landing. No mystery, no supernatural intervention, just 3 men doing their duty at the edge of the world, and the ocean reaching up to claim them in a moment of inattention. That should be the end of it. A workplace accident, a tragedy of geography and timing. File it under industrial casualties and move on. Except it isn't the end, is it? The story refuses to die. The untouched meal that never was. The mad log that never existed. The phantom storm that blew through imagination instead of reality. They persist because the truth, the actual truth, is somehow worse. 3 men prepared for their work, completed their tasks, and were erased. No warning they could heed. No enemy they could fight. Just the universe demonstrating its capacity for sudden, absolute indifference. The fire's burning low. Look at that. Just embers now, glowing like the eyes of something watching from the dark. Your glass is empty. Let me remedy that. Here's to James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur. To the men who kept the light burning at the edge of the world until the world decided it had burned long enough. To the keepers who understood the rules and followed them, and died anyway, because the sea has no obligation to be fair. And here's to the stories we tell to make sense of the senseless. To the meals we imagine on tables, the logs we invent, the ghosts we populate the silence with. Because admitting that 3 competent men can simply vanish, that the explanation can be as mundane as a wave and as final as drowning, that there's no deeper meaning or hidden truth, that's harder to accept than any ghost. The Flannan Isles are still out there, 20 miles west of Lewis, black rocks rising from the Atlantic, the lighthouse blinking its automated rhythm into the night. No one lives there now, no one needs to. The ships navigate by satellite, and the old romance of the lonely keeper tending his lamp has given way to solar panels and radio signals. But on certain nights, when the wind comes hard from the west and the sea runs high, folk on Lewis say you can still hear it. Not the foghorn. The station never had one that worked properly. Something else. A sound like bells, distant and resonant, calling from the direction of the 7 hunters. Or perhaps it's just the wind in the aerials, the groan of the tower shifting on its foundation, the particular acoustics of storm-force air moving through the gaps in the masonry. You can believe whichever version comforts you. Now then, the rain's eased off outside, I see. You'll have a clear walk back, which is more than those 3 keepers had. Mind how you go. The roads are dark, and the Atlantic's a long way from here. But the lesson of the Flannans travels well enough. Some lights we build to push back the dark. And sometimes the dark pushes back harder. Safe travels. And if you ever find yourself on a western shore when the wind's up and the sea's running high, take a moment. Listen. You might hear what the keepers heard in those final seconds before the wave came. Or you might hear nothing at all. Which, when you think about it, might be worse. You've been listening to British Pub Lore. Mind how you go.